Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third webinar of the year. We've got a very exciting topic today. So we've got John Casher from HRM Consulting Services presenting today on the topic of avoiding the fury of regulators. So an exciting one. It should run for about 40 minutes today, followed by about a 20-minute Q&A towards the end of the session. So if you do have any questions throughout the presentation today, please leave them in the chat, and we look forward to answering them at the end of the session today. Otherwise, John, I might hand over to you. We can get started.
Hannah, thank you very much. It's great to be here, and welcome to everybody who's online and watching, listening to this webinar. I'm happy to be here, and as Hannah mentioned, this is an exciting topic, and maybe from the outset, I'd like to dispel that perception that's in the marketplace that policies and procedures are bureaucratic, and they're a bit of a handbrake on the business. The whole concept of policy and procedure is great because it does allow some great opportunities within organisations, and as we go through the slides, we'll see some of those highlighted, and I'll try not to bore you with too much of the detail, but the idea is to ensure that you appreciate that having good policies and procedures, having a good understanding of your policies and procedures, but also ensuring that your employees understand your policies and procedures and how best to utilise them will ensure that there's improvements in your process, ensure that there's some improvement in your culture, which is going to be a key issue as we go along. And as you then appreciate, you're in business for a whole specific raft of reasons. And if your business is such that you've got it working, that productivity increases, therefore profitability increases, having good policies and procedures as the process to help you manage that, I think is paramount for any organisation. So without further ado, I will go through the slides and give you some more detail as to what I believe are some very important processes within an organisation. So if you look at policies and procedures, they are designed, I sort of contradict myself, they are somewhat bureaucratic insofar as they will give structure. They will ensure that the workplace has a good understanding of what's fair and what's equitable. If your policies and procedures are written in such a way that people can see that it's across the board and all employees, and that includes management, are covered by these policies and procedures, then everyone will understand that this is how they're assessed, this is how they're supposed to work. These are the things they need to appreciate to work effectively in the workplace. So it helps them with the processes, it helps them with ensuring they appreciate what their rights and responsibilities are so that there's no grey area there. And having that clarity in the workplace will provide that good culture in the workplace. And I have worked in a number of organisations where, sadly, some people don't have policies and procedures. They tend to wing it and say, well, this is the vibe of the thing. This is how we work. And the employees, especially the employees, are unclear. So having that structure in there ensures that they feel good about the workplace, and they know how they work, they know the parameters with which they have to work in, and then they can maintain that work environment. They can maintain a workplace where they know what they're required to do, they know what the rules are, and just as a side, if you appreciate, policies are like the rules within your workplace. And as a quick definition, if policies are the rules, procedures are the steps you take to implement them, the same as acts and regulations and so forth, there is a set of laws and a set of steps you have to take. If your employees understand what the rules are, what they're supposed to work towards, and how they implement them, then they will work towards it. There's going to be some conversation as we go through around training, because this is really important, because it ensures that staff really know what it is they're supposed to do and how to do it, but I will come back to that. The importance of your policies, as we said before, it will give you structure, but it also ensures that employees act safely. Now, for those of you who understand work health and safety and workers' compensation claims that have come across your desk, a lot of people have said to me, but it's common sense. People shouldn't do that. I think perhaps one of the worst commodities within an organisation is that common sense is at a low ebb. And I don't mean to be facetious by saying that. I think it's important to appreciate that we can't expect our employees to know everything. it's incumbent upon management to ensure that employees really appreciate how they're supposed to act, how they're supposed to work, and what some of the dangers are if they work against those processes. So the purpose: provide support to employees to act safely and correctly, and it will reduce risk. Manual handling policies, for example. If we explain to our employees how best to lift, bend your knees, check the weights of any items that are being lifted, then they will appreciate that they can actually reduce any potential injury to themselves, but then reduce legal risk on the organisation because we've trained and developed them. We've shown our employees how best to do these particular tasks. In the Work Health and Safety Act, there is a duty on the employer to supervise, train and instruct, not necessarily in that order, but to ensure that our employees understand their obligations. So the legal requirement for an organisation is to train them, is to supervise them and instruct them on how to do their job effectively. If we have those policies that cover off all of that, then we are reducing that legal risk. As I said before, when organisations have good policies and the policies are broadcast through the organisation, in some cases we have had to, particularly in industrial environments, ensure that our customers, those delivery companies that are coming on site, the customers that we're dealing with, if they understand our policies, then they will appreciate how the organisation works. There could be policies around returns, there could be policies around payments and so forth, there could be policies around when they collect items and how they collect their items. If we're going to train our employees, then we should also train our customers as to how we operate our business so that we can ensure that as people come on site, they are safe. If people come on site, they know who to deal with, they know how to arrive, when to arrive, what to bring with them, and therefore they can have a safe and successful and expedient experience on our work site. So don't just think purely policies and procedures, just focus on your own employees. Think on how you affect those coming to site. And again, from a litigious point of view, if you hear things like public liability insurance and so forth, ensuring your policies are set in such a way to safeguard for those things is going to save you some dramas in the long run. But if we do have these good policies in place, as we spoke before, it's setting expectations, therefore giving clarification to employees on the company and its value. I'm big from an HR perspective when you talk about culture, and that culture comes from the way we relate to our employees. That culture comes from the way we act and operate and the way we present ourselves as a business. So I don't suggest that we have draconian and really dry policies that are difficult to understand and perhaps even difficult to implement. We have policies and procedures that suit our business. I'll perhaps say this a few times throughout this session, that policies and procedures cannot be vanilla flavored and therefore one size fits all. Different organizations, different ways of running business, different industries have different policies. I mentioned manual handling policy before. If you look at that as a policy and you think, well, manual handling, it's the same thing, you don't bend a certain way, you don't, you pick up a certain way, etc., etc. That's fine. But what are you picking up? Is it a box of chocolates, or is it perhaps, a crate of pillows or something like that? You might think the size is an issue, but there could be more weight in a smaller one. But your industry determines how you establish your policy. So if I'm working, and I've worked in a number of manufacturing organizations, and you think one particular item on its own might be 750 gram tin, that's perfectly fine. You put them in a box of 12, you put them on a pallet which weighs a ton, one small thing becomes a very heavy product. So giving understanding to the staff as to how that weight of that product multiplies. Giving clarity to the staff on how loading one particular can into a box can affect your health and safety by twisting or repetitive movements and so forth. works well for that business doesn't work in another business. So having those expectations, giving clarity for employees on the way we do things, we want them to do it safely. We want them to do it in a good way. It then builds a good safety culture in the organisation, and it helps the employee feel comfortable about where their business is going. So as a business owner, as a manager, perhaps heed this, that your policies can help you with determining your culture. Your policies can help you with driving change in your business. Your policies can help you create a good working environment so your employees feel good about the place they're coming into. We say very much from an HR perspective that when you look at health and safety, that we want people to come to work to do their jobs efficiently and effectively and go home safely. And I'm not pushing that particular barrow, but the whole concept around having good policies that employees adhere to and understand means they'll do their work efficiently and effectively, which will help them to do their jobs well and feel good about the way they do their jobs. Your policies are very specific to your organisation, and they'll give you guidelines to help with decision making. So if you see somebody breaching one of your policies, you can pull them aside and talk to them about how their actions are counter to the way the company wants to operate. Of course, this will only happen when you've trained them on the policies. This will only happen when you publicise your policies and have these policies available for everybody to see. If people will see what the policy boundaries are, understand when they can make decisions, when they can't make decisions. It's all well and good to empower your employees to do a particular task, but you need to train them on how to do that. You need to be able to give them the opportunity to appreciate what the boundaries are. And employees are great. They'll do a fantastic job if you tell them the scope you want them to work into. Having these policies there will help them appreciate that I can make that decision because it's within the scope of the policy. I can ensure that I can follow these steps, but once I get to this very last step, I stop because the next one is perhaps unsafe, is against the company's guidelines. So it really helps people understand, what parameters they have. If we have good policies in place as well, it's going to help employees appreciate that this is where the company wants to progress itself. We talk about strategic planning, we talk about organisational goals and objectives and so forth. How do we achieve that? Again, using policies is going to help us to make those steps along the way, because it does give us consistency. It does ensure that me as an employee, I can follow the certain steps to achieve growth. The company wants to grow its business. The company wants to be able to provide strong customer service. The company wants to provide, good products in the marketplace. Having those policies around is making sure I'm actually going to follow that and achieve the organisational goals. So I need guidelines to help me get through the stages of my work. It's important that you look at where these policies come from. And as an HR practitioner, I've had on many occasions some very deep and meaningful conversations with company executives where the flippant response is very much, just write them and put them out there. That's okay. Don't worry about it. You're the HR guy. You can make this work. And as an HR guy, I have no issues with writing the policy, but the ownership has to come from up above. Policies and procedures can't be seen as just some edict from the HR department, just some musing, some policy transcript that goes out as the rules of the organisation, because it's going to affect the way the organisation operates. My view of how the organisation operates is more often than not different to the way that the senior executive want to, particularly if it's a privately owned organisation, because they have personal benefit or gain in how the business operates. So the owner, the respective executive, the business manager needs to drive this. It drives culture first and foremost. If the organisation or the head of the organisation is out on the factory floor or the office floor saying, we promote these policies, this is what we believe, this is what we want to have happening in the organisation, then the staff are going to see that, hey, you know what, the boss is pushing this, I like this, it makes me feel comfortable because it's not something that's just thrust upon me. It's an actual fact, a cultural thing within the organisation. So for all those business owners out there listening to this, please think about your obligations here to actually drive it. And I was buoyed by a meeting I had with a business owner just last week, and we were talking about his policies and procedures and the enthusiasm with which he wanted to ensure his policies and procedures were not only up to date, but they were implemented correctly. They were disseminated to the staff. The staff were trained on these policies and procedures, thus giving him a good platform to work from was great to see. So I really urge all business owners and all senior executives to think about this, that they need to drive this. HR will help you, HR will support you through the writing and the legal side of this, but the ownership has to come from the top, and I can't stress that enough, because it does then filter down into your working environment, filter into your culture. I'll probably say culture about a dozen more times this morning, but it does actually filter through and allow you to have your good feel good, I should say, environment within the workplace. So the fundamentals, they are instructions. They give instruction on how a particular policy is to be implemented. Now, just off the top of my head, there are many policies and procedures that you could have, and we'll go through sort of some of the headlines in a minute. Those instructions on different things need to be written in such a way that is particular to that task. So if we look at the black and white, a policy is an instruction manual. It helps you get through. That's the fine of it. It provides steps and guides for all employees. Absolutely it does, to ensure that three people working in the same business, working in the same process, will follow the same steps to ensure that they complete their tasks the same way, and to ensure that nothing's missed, nothing's changed, and that we don't step outside the guideline. Of course, if we do breach policy, and then there's sort of an area that we don't want to necessarily cloud this discussion with, but clearly, like most things, if you're driving along the road and you're speeding, there is going to be ramifications for breaching that road rule. Again, in a workplace, maybe not as severe, of course, but as employees, and sometimes they do, and often they do, may step outside the boundaries of that policy, then it needs to be a conversation. And I'm emphasising the word conversation in the first place, because if somebody steps outside of that policy, it can't simply be, well, that's just not good enough, and you terminate somebody. And I know that you think that's probably a flippant statement to make, but if an employee doesn't follow the rules 100%, you need to understand why. It may well simply be that employee has just not understood the training. That employee has not necessarily been able to follow suit, or something unusual has happened, which means they had to change that. So in most things, then, communication is a big deal for me. Understand where the employees are coming from, understand what the mitigating circumstances are, because if they do step outside, you want to know, because maybe you have to change your training or change the policy to suit. But that's something you consider at the time. So if you look at these headings here, and I won't go through, won't have to necessarily delve into every single one, but from where I'm coming from, these are the headers of the policies that I would write for a workplace. So we have policies around communication, consultation in the workplace. It's a big thing. Steps back to that last statement, where if you have effective communication with your employees, whenever they feel they need to talk to you, or wherever you feel you need to talk to them, it's not a scary thing for them. So if you have policies and train them on those policies around communications, then people are prepared for it, and it allows for the open door policies and all those sorts of policies in the workplace, where you can safely have a good open dialogue around specific issues in the workplace. Going down the table, work health and safety, big policies in organisations, and given the changes to health and safety over the last few years, and the emphasis on work health and safety, and the emphasis on how we ensure our workplace is safe, and how we need to provide safe work and training. And as I said before, we need to train, instruct and supervise our teams. Work health and safety policies are big, and these are things like your health and safety, drug and alcohol policies, manual handling policies, etc., etc. There are many policies that fall under this umbrella. Training and development policies are quite big, and as the name suggests, it would be paramount for employees to have policies around how they train their employees, how they look at development, whether that's external studies, whether it's internal training, whether it's on-the-job training. It's part of your, inductions and introductions to the workplace. But having policies in the work at work that allow you to implement training, again, gives people comfort around the fact they work for an organisation that wants to train and develop me and help me grow through the organisation. Benefits, of course, remuneration sits in there. You've got bonus schemes in some organisations. There might be salary sacrificing, those sorts of policies. I'm going to leave cessation for a moment. Conditions of employment will help you appreciate some things around how you act within the workplace, ensuring that you don't necessarily act in a certain way which is contrary to the company's way of doing things. Having sound recruitment selection policies, ensuring that you recruit people and not breaching privacy laws or discriminatory laws and so forth. So ensuring that you have a good recruit and select and an onboarding process. This one, I think, when you look at all the policies, is also a very high marker for me. Now, all of them, of course, are. But performance management, if you look at bringing people into your organisation, you want to have good policies that would help you with the way you manage the performance of the individual, from your probation periods, position descriptions, annual assessments and reviews, even leading off to perhaps even some disciplinary procedures as well. So you need to have these structures in place, because if we start looking at regulators, and this is where cessation comes into it, and I'll probably jump to that as well. If you don't have your policies that are accurate and appropriate, when it comes time to maybe some formalities around how you deal with employee breaches, you could find yourself in a whole lot of hot water. If you look at performance management, and these are sort of fundamentals, but the amount of times I've had to speak to managers around, when you had that formal meeting, did you offer a witness? When you had that formal meeting, did you structure the meeting in such a way to put the issues to the employee and allow the employee time to review them and respond to those, let's say, allegations? And it does concern me a bit that on occasion the manager said, well, I brought them in the room, I read them the Riot Act, and now they've got a final warning. Not based on any policy, not based on any process, but based on the fact that the manager had the cranks and decided to actually just go straight to that final process. Now, for those of you who have been involved with industrial relations issues, you know that that's just not going to cut it. A, there's been no witness allowed. B, there's been no opportunity to provide a reason as to why the actions were taken. Furthermore, you'd question how the announcement was made. Was the employee just dragged in the office, just on spec and told what was going on? Was there time for the employee to understand what was going on? Was the employee prepared, etc., etc.? If that matter went to the Industrial Relations Commission, or Fair Work, I should say, you'd find that matter would be thrown out because due process wasn't followed. The manager thinks he's done the right thing by, calling in a breach and telling the employee about that, but it's the way you do it. Because if it leads to cessation effectively, there's been some issues where even when people have followed a process and they've terminated somebody, they've followed the 3 strikes and you're out. Your first warning, second warning, final warning, away you go. Even if in your letters you don't put in comments around further action in this way could lead to termination, if you don't even put something like that in your letters, which comes out of your policy, of course, then the termination could be deemed unfair. These are reasons why I actually like policies. These are reasons why I like to promote policies, because it's not to trick organisations, it's actually to safeguard organisations, to make sure that when it comes to formal matters, putting policies in around, providing bonuses to employees, that's nice, that's a good feel about it. But sometimes we have to be a bit tough as employers and say, sorry, you don't meet the company standards, you breached policy, we have to let you go. That happens, I get that. But it's ensuring that you follow specific steps as an employer keeps you out of trouble, particularly from Fair Work's perspective. So we talk about having robust policies and procedures in place so that all employees can adhere to them, and it will alleviate claims coming through at a later time. If your policy around performance management or counselling and discipline is such, and it's been vetted and it's been communicated and it runs through the business, if you follow that policy and procedure, as long as it's not breaching any employment laws, then that's your policy and that's fine. And you've acted on those policies and that's fine. But it's when you have a policy and you act outside of that policy is where you're going to find yourself in trouble. So have these policies, ensure that they're up to date, and we talk about the timeliness of your policies and review of your policies. As long as you follow these policies, then that's going to be your guidelines to ensuring that you have a proper process and try and alleviate some of the issues with any regulators. We've spoken about this before, and I'll just quickly recap on this again. It does provide a range of benefits to all employees and the organisation and stakeholders. So if we know what our policies are, it helps us to work more efficiently and effectively. It provides guidance with regards to clarification of actions. And as I said before, instruction, training and guidance is key. So if you want your employees to lift that box in a certain way, if you want your employees to communicate in a certain way, if you want your employees to follow a bonus scheme in a certain way, have the steps outlined properly so that all employees go, I get it, I understand it, I know what how I'm going to act, and I can follow that dutifully. If, as most employers would be, if you've educated them and you've shown them how they do their work, then it allows them to get on with the job. I can go to my desk every day. I can follow the processes because I know what's expected of me. I know how I'm supposed to be operating, which is a great thing from an employee's perspective. You come to your desk, you do your job, you get on with it. You're not thinking, well, is this right? Is this wrong? You know it's right because that's how you were trained. This is what the company wants you to do. And I guess if it comes to a situation where somebody doesn't follow that policy or that process 100%, you will know. It's not going to be a surprise when someone taps you on the shoulder and say, look, that's not exactly how we want it done. Yep, I get that because I know what the policy is. Therefore, we improve customer service. And as it rolls on, you improve customer service, you improve productivity, you improve profitability, but also having your team doing their work really well, it's going to improve your reputation as an organisation. Because the organisation runs effectively, the organisation and its employees will do their work dutifully and diligently. And therefore, when it comes to providing a service internally or externally, there is a great element of confidence in the way they do that because they know what's expected. Hence, having consistency, we don't make the mistakes because we know what's expected of us. It helps us with our behaviour. Again, goes back to culture. We have, policies that help us to appreciate that working in this environment, working this way means that we can follow a good process. It's fair. There's good quality outcomes. We accept and understand that things are going to be done a little bit differently, but we follow the pattern to get to the end result. So therefore, we can't be sort of biased. Well, John does it this way because that's how John likes to do it. No. John follows the process. And therefore we all work in the same routine. So, we're getting some great importance out of the policies. We appreciate that if we look back again, if you follow these purposes in front of you and we allow the employees to get on with their job, then we are going to avoid any issues from anybody from outside, particularly the regulators saying, well, what you're doing is wrong. Because you've used legislation to help you establish your policies, because you've looked at codes of practice and best practice guides and so forth, you know that what you're introducing to your policy is going to be supported by these resources. You know that your policies are going to be, if they're tested, you can quite happily put your hand on your heart and say, well, we used the Work Health and Safety Act to help us develop our work health and safety policies. So that's the basis that you're coming from. This is not something that you make up. So again, if there is an issue around, let's say workers' compensation, and somebody has injured themselves, the first thing that people are going to be talking to you about, particularly the regulators, is how were your employees trained to do their job? Did they have position descriptions? Did they have duty statements? Did they have sufficient information to show them how best to do their job? Yes, because within our policy, when we've looked at, providing training, instruction, and supervision, we've been able to ensure that all people driving forklifts, loading pallets, wrapping pallets, and so forth, they have been trained on how they do their job. They have their duty statement showing them how they do their job. They have a supervisor overseeing how they do their job. So we're providing, as far as reasonably practicable, and if this was a health and safety seminar, I'd go into further detail about that, but we have provided a lot of support to ensure that happens. So the regulator will look at that and say, well, you've done all the right things. You've tried to mitigate all those issues there. So having your policies based on these resources is a fundamental, because these are all documents that have been in the marketplace, that have been tested by industry groups and by, regulators and people probably far smarter than me to get them to a point where these are proper process. So when you write your policies, make sure that these are the guiding principles to how you develop your policies and procedures. When it comes to introducing your policies and also referring back to legislation, it's important that that your employees understand where your guiding principles are coming from. So there are duties that are applied to organisations and therefore managers to ensure that when your employees come to work for you, particularly, it'd be nice to do it when you have them starting. You have your employee handbook, you have your induction process and onboarding processes, where you give them an outline of where the information has come from, what has determined this policy and procedure, what has determined the way we operate in this business, what has determined our safeguards, and referring back to those resources before will ensure that your employees particularly will think, this is great. There is something that is proven in the marketplace that's going to set the standards here. It's going to allow employees and employers to feel comfortable about where the process is coming from. The second part of it, obviously, with regards to duties, is ensuring that there is timely feedback. And that should go both ways. We spoke about communications before, but it should go both ways, that we provide feedback on how an employee is operating. Before I mentioned, if somebody does step outside the line of a particular policy, then under your performance policies that you'll have, you will quite quickly pull that employee aside and say, John, did you appreciate that when you were working in this fashion, you're actually working against the way we wanted to do it? The policy states this. We need you to be mindful of that. It's not a formal counselling session. It's perhaps coaching on the run. It's perhaps just an informal verbal review of the process. That's all part of your policy, of course. But providing that quick feedback ensures that John, me, I just get back into line again. It's not to make me feel bad about myself. It's ensuring that I follow a certain path. It's ensuring that I actually am doing the job that I'm supposed to do. So you provide me that feedback, and that's fundamental. Again, if you look at any issues that may end up in the courts, in the commission, one of the first conversations that you may have with the mediator, for me to get in front of the conciliator, will be that, what level of conversation was held around this particular issue. And if there's, crickets at that time where you don't actually answer that effectively, this is where it's going to get you in trouble. So, one of the reasons why communication policies were sitting at the top of that table before was that I would suggest, as strongly as I could, that you would look at those sorts of processes fairly quickly and look at your communication. And again, the duties of the organisation is to ensure that we provide information, training and supervision. We allow our people to understand what it is we want them to do. I'm going over this again and again and again because I can't sort of urge this enough. You don't want to have, and back in my day, policies and procedures used to sit in a lever arch file on top of a cabinet, which was getting very dusty. Nowadays, of course, they're in intranet sites and in the cloud and so forth. Wherever you store your policies, You don't want them just sitting there, never opened. You want people, and you want to have your teams trained, assessed, to understand how the policies are operating. And one of the big things that I would strongly suggest to you is that when you look at the provision of information and training, more so, and let's pick on manual handling again. You will train your team on manual handling. You will then assess them on how they understand that policy. And that assessment should really be a paper document or an online document, depending on how savvy you are, that asks them to actually respond to specifics within that policy to gauge the level of understanding. And then you record that, and as long as they meet the criteria, then they're successfully passed, as with any sort of assessment. If the employee doesn't quite get it, then it needs to be retrained again so that there's actually some opportunity for that employee to get up to speed, to be able to be aware of it. So there's a big emphasis on not just having your policies written, but it's also having them disseminated to the employees, having them assessed on their understanding of that policy, and then ensuring that you keep track of that. And in 12 months' time, you're going to do it again, or whenever you do a change to your policy, because we know our policies change often. They might change because of legislative requirements. We've had some changes to the Fair Work Act with the closing the loopholes legislation coming through. That would then change a number of your policies. That change then should generate training for your employees to educate them on what the changes are and how it affects them in the workplace. Once you've trained them, you assess them, you identify that they understand it, you record, you hold that, and that is going to be able to be used for you to show the regulators, we've trained our people, they understand it, and this is how they understand. So there are some definite duties for the employer's perspective. From the employee's perspective, it's important they understand and they are fully aware of what the requirements are of their role and the expectations of the company. There is an obligation for you, the employer, to train them on that, but there's an obligation for the employee to also make sure that they take it on board, they try and develop themselves further and further. The big ticket here is that the employee should ensure they adhere to organisation policies and procedures. And if they don't understand, then they ask questions. We can't really allow our employees not to be aware of the policies. We can't as employers. Just ignore the fact that people need to be trained. The policy's there, they'll read it, they'll understand it by osmosis, not a problem. Yeah, we can't just be that apathetic about it. We need to make sure that we are pushing that and also getting our employees to come back to us and say, yep, I get that, I understand that, hence the training, hence the review of the assessment, hence the recording of that to ensure that we either can retrain them or we can feel confident that they fully understand that they're doing their job. But all the while, we want to have that relationship with the employee that's backwards and forwards. The employee comes to us and keeps asking questions and making sure that they can get on and do their job effectively and efficiently. There will always be changes. There will always be moments where you look at your policy and say, this is out of date. Sadly, and with one organisation I was talking to, their policy was last reviewed in 2013. Which obviously before I came on board to have a chat to them about this, and you can appreciate that what was happening in 2013 is completely different to what's happening in 2024. They need to look at their policies, make sure that they're across them, because there are legislative changes. That will be the first reason why you need to update your policy. The second reason could be a change within the organisation. Your organisation might grow, your organisation might become more mechanical, more technical. There are changes in your workplace. Those changes will bring about change to your policies. So this is why we promote very strongly that policies and procedures need to be updated regularly, reviewed and updated. 12 months, 2 years, depending on changes to legislation, that could work. Depending on changes to the organisation, that could work. But as I said, and I don't mean to be flippant and make make an item of this particular company, but 2013 is meaning that policy is not going to be valid, and meaning that if anything happened under that policy and the regulators walked in, then there would be a lot of improvement notices and perhaps a lot of money and fines being paid. So we don't want to have that happening. As I said before, policies and procedures change with industry, change with size of organisation. Therefore, one size doesn't fit all. So look at your industry and you have a friend in another industry. Don't just copy and paste their policies because it's not going to work for you. So please make sure that you focus your policy on your business and your industry. And be aware of what's happening in your economic world as well. For those of us who remember the GFC, the global financial crisis, it changed a whole way of doing business for a number of organisations. I was working in a sector that was gravely hit by the GFC, and we had to do a lot of changing, a lot of juggling, and reevaluating of our policies and our processes. So there was some complete rewrites, and that's going to happen because if your radar changes, you should change your policies along with that, so you can then follow that pattern. I can't stress that enough. You've got to think about what's happening. So don't just say policy's written, happy days. We need to change and keep up to date with it. Okay. And just so looking at this quickly, when it comes to, and this is a case study that came up a little while ago. I won't go through the whole case study, but there was a dispute between an employee and an organisation around performance management. There was a policy in the organisation which was great to start with, but it was outdated. It didn't necessarily fit the current practice of the organisation. So the organisation didn't follow its own policies and just went off their own back, just went outside their policies. There is another situation perhaps where the policy exists but doesn't properly cover the situation, so they use precedent to help them determine their outcomes. You can't really be guessing these things. You can't say, well, I've got this issue here, policy's a little bit outdated, I'll just, maybe Google it or ChatGPT a resolution and come up with it. You just can't do that because that's not going to stand up, obviously. And what it's going to do is make you out to be, less than across your process. Now, organizations and managers in the businesses, when it comes to doing some formal reviews on policies, it's not the most comfortable thing to either terminate an employee or make a tough call. But if you have a policy that exists and that policy suits your business, that policy suits the legislation, the current legislation and codes of practice, then that is your guide. It's still not going to be an easy process, but that is your guide that you're going to work towards. So please consider that as how you deal with it. So if your policy is out of date, then you need to update it very, very quickly. So you can see then how your policies play a pivotal role in promoting workplace fairness. They will ensure that they provide direction on managing the situation. So we have this structure. It's across the board. Everyone understands it. We follow that to the nth degree. And we know that if something changes in our environment, technologies, et cetera, then we as an organisation need to be ready to change with it. We can't sit back and say, the GFC happened in October, it's now March the following year, we haven't updated our policies and we're still running on old systems. It's not going to make it work efficiently for you, okay? Your policies are very much live documents. Your policies must change to suit the environment. The policies need to be robust enough that you can look at them as a manager, you can look at them as an employee, you can look at them as a regulator and say, these are appropriate to what we need them to be. They are good, they are reasonable, they are fair, they meet legislative requirements, and therefore they're good guidelines, good processes to use to make sure that you do what you need to do efficiently and effectively. As I said it before, and I'll sort of start winding down on this, it is important from a consultation and cooperation best practice guide that we do have open dialogue within the workplace. You do have this great backwards and forwards with your employees to be able to say, I recognise that we're working in this environment. I recognise that there are changes. I recognise that there is legislative issues that are out there and we must follow them. So we want to bring you up to speed with what these changes are. We want you to work safely. We want you to work properly and effectively and professionally. We want you to enjoy what's happening in the workplace. We also need your feedback to make sure that we do this properly. So having conversations, if you have consultative forums in the workplace, or you have an opportunity to sit down with your team and get their feedback, please do it, because if you're implementing a policy that's going to affect them, it would be handy to have their buy into it. It's also prudent that when you have these conversations that you perhaps bring in an external party, consultants, even talking to Fair Work or Work Health and Safety or the like, to get someone to just sense check what you're doing to make sure that you are doing this properly. Again, if you're getting people outside who work in this all day, every day, giving you direction on it, when it comes time for an issue to occur, you know relatively well that you're going to be supported throughout this process. So please think about that. But the consultation and cooperation in the workplace is huge, because that then ensures your communication is strong enough and the employees will want to talk to you about this. Okay. So when you look at your policies, then it improves your performance because it allows for greater productivity. It makes people feel better about the workplace because they participate in what's happening. And as you find most things, an employee will go to work because they want to achieve, they want to do well. Money's in there at some stage, but if you look at some of the tables, that's sitting about 5 or 6. Achieving tasks and participating in the workplace is higher up the ladder. So people are participating in development of how they work in the work environment that they're in, increased job satisfaction. It improves the culture. Therefore, you have absenteeism issues reduced, turnover reduces. I know even in one business, we changed some concerns where we avoided some sabotage, and you wouldn't think that that still happens in some industries, but people get disgruntled, and next thing you know, they may have wiped something off your computer system. That's an extreme, of course. They might work to rule and not put products out when they're supposed to because they're not happy with the way that things work. So think about how your policies and your processes can help you improve the way people enjoy the workplace. Ultimately, you have good health and well-being in the organisation. People feel comfortable about it. People are working knowing how they should pick up that or they should move that pallet using a mechanical device, not just picking it up, not being He-Man and trying to lift up heavy items. We improve that health and well-being. It reduces the incidence of injury in the workplace. Therefore, workers' comp premiums are down. Therefore, staff feel better about coming to work. The staff members' family feels better about them coming to work because they come home safely every day. And that's just a little side issue to think of too. If we have good policies and processes in the workplace, then when they go home and tell their family about how safe it is to work there, how strong the communication is, how well that they get on with people, it just has a better resonance out in the marketplace as well. Finally, we look at record keeping. As we said before, these are live documents. Having them in a place that they can be retrieved quickly and easily is paramount. Having them written in such a way that it's easy to read, easy to understand is paramount. And if you look at things like where your records are and statute of limitations, the time you keep them, and making sure that if a regulator comes in asking for them, you can easily provide them. So your record keeping in this, don't just put them in a file somewhere and they're lost. Put them in an open log where people can see them, where they're easily found. And as I say, regulators will be much happier about asking you for that particular policy. You put your hands on it within a few minutes. It's going to make them feel more confident that you know where your policies are and how well they are up to date, especially when you keep track of them, because you'll have document control that piggybacks off this. Every time you change a policy, document control has to be there to show where the changes have come from and what the changes have been. All right, so what we need to do at the end of the day is we need to have good written update policies and procedures, and emphasis on up to date. Okay, we need to then train and instruct our employees on these policies and ensure that they understand what their obligations and duties are with these policies. Provided this proper training includes refresher training, so don't do it today and that's it. Do it again if your policy changes. Then make sure that you train them again. Even if after 12 months you have a manual handling policy, for example, or a operational policy, then get your team aside again and refresher training. We used to do refresher training on manual handling, forklift driving, hazardous substances, all those sorts of things, so that employees knew that they were up to date with that. And one of the good things about having your policies in an organisation is it helps you balance the practices and drive efficiencies, because we have productivity measures in these policies as well. So policies are great, but they will always ensure that you remain legislatively it's a hard word to say, I'm sorry, compliant. You don't want regulators watching over your shoulder. You don't want regulators, and having had this in industrial businesses, once is okay. The second time you're in front of them, they get a bit edgy. The next time they start going, this company is a problem. I'm going to pay very close attention to them. And so you want the regulators to leave you alone. So you want the regulators to feel comfortable with the fact that you know exactly what it is you're doing with your policies and procedures. Now, we were going to do some questions there. So, Hannah, is there anything that's come through that you would like to perhaps raise that you want me to have a look at?
Yeah, we've had two questions, John, one from Laura and one which was submitted ahead of the session today. With regards to Laura's question, hers is, does feedback in regards to employee job requirements sit separate to performance management?
Not necessarily, because the job requirements are obviously fundamental to the way you do your tasks. And the way your performance managed is fundamental to the way you do your tasks. So they all intertwine. If there's issues you want to provide feedback on job tasks, then that sits under a performance management process. It also fits under a communication process of providing feedback on specific things within your workplace. So it doesn't have to be a formal process. It can quite easily be a nice, and this would be in one of your policies to say that there is, using that cliche open door process, you can always come back to me and say, you don't understand, can you get further requirements of? If it gets to a formal performance review, sadly, sometimes that's a little bit more structured and we don't necessarily always have to get to that place. So always raise the question early.
Yeah, great point. And we've just had another one come through, John, from Fred. His question is, should an organisation have a form of regular reporting mechanism on a set of key indicators, for example, to the relevant governance body within the entity to track compliance, performance, and address current, new, emerging risks?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Thanks, Fred. Not every organisation does that. And you find that, and I'll be politically correct here, I guess, that you'll find large organisations with large bureaucracies, particularly within their HR divisions, for example, will provide statistics back on the number of employees and the types of employees, etc., etc., etc. They are within that, but not every organisation provides that. And I guess whether they fly under the radar or they don't register for it is probably something that we could look into further. But Fred, yeah, we should be reporting back on a number of statistics, but not everybody does it. So I think having the organisation being able to manage its own systems and processes is probably the best place to start. And yes, they should look at registering themselves with the specific bodies. Now, having an association is also a good place to help you ensure that you are maintaining your reporting requirements, because the association should also be dealing with the regulators at a higher level to make sure that we're all compliant. So maybe good, if you have an association, Fred, maybe a good conversation for them as well.
And another follow-up question, John, from Fred was, have you found government agencies any more or less effective than private organisations?
I have an affinity with government organisations, having worked with a number of them, Fred. One of the reasons I went into one of the government organisations is because I appreciated their penchant for policy, procedure, guidelines and processes is somewhat stronger than a lot of private sector organisations where policies and procedures lapse. It's getting that balance though, Fred, because some of them have actually gone so far to this side that you can't actually get a policy and you can't actually get effectiveness out of your policies and procedures because the employees don't know them, because there's like 80 to 100 policies and procedures and employees don't know them all. And I'm sort of quoting one specific area where we had an issue around a performance process, and as the HR guy, I followed this certain path following legislation and best practice guides, and they referred me to a document which was hidden away in the annals of the organisation that didn't come out too often. So I was heading down the wrong path because I didn't know this existed. So there is a great opportunity to develop those policies, but across the board with every organisation, Fred, we need to ensure that those policies and procedures are communicated to all employees. Everyone's trained on them and understands them so that they can actually implement them effectively.
Great. Thanks, John, and thanks, Fred, for the questions. John, probably a final one here from Jared, which is submitted ahead of today's session. His question is, what specific funeral industry policies should a company ensure are up to date and regularly reviewed?
All your policies need to be up to date and reviewed. But without being too facetious, there are a number of standard policies and procedures you would look at around health and safety and code of conduct and communications, harassment, bullying, but then also in the funeral industry, you have a mixture of like funeral directors and morticians and landscapers and so forth. So there's a mix of office and so white collar, blue collar. So you would also look at ensuring that you have policies and procedures around manual handling and hazardous substances and every business has a hazardous substance, whether it's liquid paper or it's petrol or it's something gases or whatever else. So understanding, particularly in the fuel industry, there what you have as your tools for your operation, making sure that you have policies to manage that. So for the funeral industry, I'd probably say let's look at your standards around performance management and people safety and hazards as well, to ensure that we don't necessarily overlook some of the key issues of the business. But I would probably go further to say it would be prudent to actually sit down and look at your business now and say, well, how do we operate and what do we need to safeguard against? As I said, if you look at the external side of the business around the mortuary and landscaping and so forth, not every business has that. So your business may have that, the next one doesn't have it. So seeing what's key for your business would be a great, sit around the table and think about what we need to do for our business.
Lovely. Thanks, John. So that's about all the questions we've got so far. We've got about 3 minutes left of the session today, and just wanted to remind everyone that the session has been recorded, and we will be emailing a copy of the recording after today's session as well. But John, in the final 3 minutes, is there any final remarks or closing statements that you wanted to make?
Probably wouldn't mind just having a little bit of a checklist then, which is available to you. So, and these are questions you can think about. Do you know if you have up-to-date policies and procedures? And do you know where these policies and procedures are stored? If they're stored electronically, how easy can you access them? And if they're stored in paper, because some organisations still do that, again, how easily accessible are they? Are your policies in keeping with current legislation and business practices? And this is a key, and probably to some of those questions that came through. Look at what you have now, pull them out, let's have a review of them, because you want to make sure that they are up to date. Maybe just as a question for you to think about right now, and you don't have to answer this, obviously, is when was the last time you reviewed these policies? Remember, I said that I had somebody who had a policy that was last written in 2013, and that's obviously well and truly out of date. Even, maybe a 22 policy is perhaps out of date. So have a think about where your policies are at and when your last review was. And if you don't know when it was reviewed, please go and have a look at it. Are all your policies and procedures supported and approved by senior management, the owner, managing director, CEO? Because as we said, that's where it needs to come from. It needs to be driven from the top so that all levels of the business appreciate that this is a company-wide document, not just a HR thing. What training did you provide for your employees? Now, whether it's an introduction to that, whether it's a specific training and an actual training process around manual handling where you're lifting and bending and so forth, where you're physically doing the training, either way, you need to have that training provided. And if it's provided, how are the employees assessed? And if they are assessed, how do you record those outcomes? Is there actually documented outcomes assessed that John Casher did this manual handling training on the 24th of September and he passed? He better pass. And if he has, then when do we do our follow-up? Okay, so if you look at those checklists there, just as an instance right now, you should go away and think, oh, wow, what are the things I need to worry about in my policies? Have a look at these and they should get you started very quickly. And that's probably about it there, Hannah.
Wonderful. Well, we're pretty much on time, but thanks a lot for today's presentation, John. It was wonderful, and I'm sure I know I got a lot out of it, so I'm sure everyone watching virtually did as well. But thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll be in touch with an email. I'll copy John into the email if anyone has any further questions. Please reach out to John or myself, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, team. Thanks, everybody.